Urban Cultural Studies,
the podcast.
interviews.
And welcome to Urban Cultural Studies Podcast. Today our guest is Eugenia Afinoguénova, who is professor at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a graduate of Moscow University in Russia and Georgetown University here in the United States. Afinoguénova is mostly known as a scholar of Spanish film, literature, and tourism. For the last several years, she has been conducting research about urban leisure in Madrid and its impact on the famous art museum, the Prado. Welcome to the program, Eugenia. It's great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ben.
I've just read your article. It's titled Liberty at the Merry-Go-Round, Leisure, Politics, and Municipal Authority on the Paseo del Prado in Madrid, 1760 to 1939. You're essentially concerned with the intersection of politics and public space in a central area of Madrid, the way that people, citizens, make use of and occupy public areas. And it's probably not necessary to point out to our listeners that this topic is something that has received much media attention in the wake of the Occupy movements. In Spain, of course, before the U.S. occupiers, you have 15M, which stands for May 15th, 2011, and refers to the Spanish occupation of central areas of Madrid in protest against dire economic and social conditions. I'm hoping that you can make a temporal link for us. What are the questions that 15M brings up for you that are links to Madrid's history?
Well, right. Occupy Wall Street and the fairground. Seems counterintuitive. My article actually is about the balance of power between the city and the state concerning the regulation of urban leisure. But then what does it have to do with the Occupy movement?
Right.
Do you remember how the occupied areas looked? Essentially, there were large groups of people doing nothing in public for weeks. What kind of uprising is that?
You're saying that upon first glance, it seemed that participants were essentially occupying the street and public areas, but that they weren't necessarily actively protesting.
Well, some of the participants called it a campground.
The idea that people were camping out in public, essentially.
And others looked at what was happening and remembered the French theory from the 1960s, Henri Lefebvre and Guy Debord, situationists, and called it an urban festival. But what happened is that once you call this a campground, urban authorities begin applying a campground rule and cleaning the area.
Right.
As far as the urban festival comparison goes, many of the participants, at least in Madrid, just hated it. If you've got a chance, take a look on YouTube. There is a video that at the time was considered a musical video anthem of the Madrid Occupy movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's called La clave está en Sol. The key is on the Puerta del Sol. Puerta del Sol is the central square of Madrid that was occupied in May 2011. The lyrics of that song run, Esto no es una fiesta, es un cabreo, meaning this is not a party, this is a fit of rage.
Wow. A fit of rage. In my view, that's a great redirection from the protesters because it gets the point across that, and this idea stems from both Lefebvre and Debord, that urban spectacle isn't just about entertainment, but also about resistance.
Okay. But in Madrid, for example, a portable library was arranged and a whole program of free entertainment was put together. So anyways, in my article, I wanted to put this picture into a historical perspective. We see a leisurely crowd against the backdrop of an urban landmark. So what? And here I go. In Spain, there is a long tradition of gathering in urban squares and parks and spending days and nights there doing nothing to celebrate patron saints. This is called a verbena.
Now, I know your interest lies beyond the mere existence of these events, and we'll soon get to that, but first tell us about the tradition of the outdoor verbenas. How were they started? Where did they take place, and how were they reacted to?
Yes, and by the way, if you don't know what a verbena or verbena is, don't worry. Technically, it's simply a plant, and I have one growing in a pot at home. But, at least since pre-Roman times, this was the plant that young people were supposedly picking on the night of summer solstice. Of course, they probably were not exactly picking verbena. But what is important is that in Spanish, that became the name for the summer festival of Saint John the Baptist, San Juan, held on June 23rd. And as you understand, this was a semi-pagan rural festival, and in the cities, people gathered in the outskirts.
Now, when did it become an urban festival?
Apparently, Carlos III, Spanish 18th century king who was a great-grandson of King Louis XIV, simply moved the celebration to the Prado Promenade once it was built.
Okay.
So historians explain that the civilizing, enlightened king felt that he had to tame whatever was happening on that day. According to an 18th century belief, violence, rapes, alcohol abuse, and whatever else was happening during pagan festivals or semi-pagan festivals of this kind would stop once you move the celebration into a linear, transparent, and elegant place inside the city.
Of course.
However, in the early 1800s, Spanish kings were still trying to prohibit dances and stick fights in the Casa del Campo, where the festival used to happen before it was moved to the center of Madrid. Interestingly, inside the city, the only prohibitions were, and here I quote, rustic and ridiculous musical instruments, end of quote, alongside things like obscenity, indecent behavior, and hitting each other with tree branches.
So there was a ban on tree branches. What's the problem with tree branches?
Well, that was pagan. No good on an official church holiday. The tree was precisely our verbena or verbena, whatever substituted for it. Now, the festival itself was not just a pagan tradition turned into a religious holiday. It was an event embedded in the urban lifestyle because San Juan, St. John the Baptist, was the day for hiring and firing servants. So what do we have? We have a day, and in fact, it was several days because San Juan was immediately followed by the San Pedro and San Pablo verbenas. So these were several days, almost a week, when it was okay to gather in groups, make bonfires, and spend the night under the stars. Logically, then, those who were losing their jobs were simply camping on the Prado in the hopes of finding a roof before too long.
Now, not everyone liked the verbenas.
No, of course not.
How did the city authorities and the vendors react to these events?
Just imagine, for example, how the directors of the Prado Museum reacted. The museum stands right in the middle of the Prado Promenade. It's full of beautiful paintings, and there are nightly bonfires right there, right under the windows. Of course, the directors complained a lot, especially at the time of state crisis. But it took a lot of time to make the city interfere, and even when it did, the verbenas were soon back. The conflict really shaped up when a world-class hotel, the Ritz, was built on the Prado in 1915. And then the city partnered with the businesses to keep the masses away. Then many of those who were looking at the masses and grudgingly tolerating them took revenge. For instance, one newspaper reported that the concierges of the fancy blocks of flats around the Prado started putting petroleum jelly on the benches to assist the city in cleaning the area.
Probably not your first choice of seating.
But the real reason for controlling the pastimes was, of course, political. I mentioned how when the street protests became a major factor in politics, the verbena-philia and verbena-phobia, as I call them, became the hot talking points.
So looking at how public space was controlled in Madrid in previous centuries, at how seemingly straightforward festivals are embedded nonetheless in political relationships, and I'll say also that these are urban relationships, this can help us understand, or rather it's necessary that we understand this historical tradition if we're going to make sense of contemporary urban protests.
Definitely. This brings us to the second part of my argument. Nowadays, people tend to imagine municipal authorities as a state in miniature, as a mini-me of the state or a microcosm. But this image is more accurate when we talk about the city-states of the antiquity or about the centralized nation-states of the modern times. This has not always been this way. And actually in Spain, even in the 19th century, we see many occasions when citizens who were denied suffrage rights or were unhappy with the course that the central government was taking would simply organize municipal resistance.
Sure, this is what is known as the Movimiento Juntero, the so-called juntas movement.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to 2011, and what do we have? Who gave the orders to clean the area or evacuate the occupiers? Not so easy to tell. In New York, The Occupy movement concentrated on a private property, so Mayor Bloomberg simply allowed the owners to proceed as they wished appropriate. In Philadelphia, a public area was occupied, and the mayor, Michael Nutter, got involved and sent the police in.
And there are numerous other accounts of such cleansings. In fact, there's a short-form article in the same issue of the journal as your research article that looks at Occupy Pittsburgh. But what happened in Spain?
In Madrid and Barcelona, it was the regional governments, gobiernos autonómicos, not municipalities, that exercised pressure on the Interior Ministry that simply carried out their orders. In Madrid, the vendors' associations were also active. But what the municipal authorities did in Madrid was exactly what they also did in all other cities. Show a nice, amiable face, and then use force under the pretext of a common good. Usually the common good was safety, public hygiene, or the needs of commerce. In Barcelona, the announced reason for cleaning the Plaza de Catalunya was to collect all sharp objects that could be used in an event of a possible violent clash among soccer fans.
This is somewhat of a sidetrack, but who was playing that game?
You see, Barca versus Manchester game was scheduled for next day. Barca won 3-1 and nothing happened anyways.
And in Madrid?
In Madrid, while the regional government and the Interior Ministry were figuring out what to do, the city simply commissioned a report from its public health department about the state of affairs on the Puerta del Sol that the indignados were occupying. So it looks like no matter whether municipal authorities did or did not give direct orders to the police, the same set of issues were brought up in Spain and in the United States.
Right.
Public health and safety. In Madrid and in New York, as I understand, there was also another reason, advocated by the city's commercial associations, the loss of income through the damage to tourism, hotel business, and retail.
So the question would be, why in Madrid did the municipal authorities act the way that they did?
Yeah, that's precisely what I asked myself. Why were municipal authorities acting as sort of double-faced good cop? There are many answers, but the one that I propose has to do with the moral origins of modern municipal power and also with the history of land ownership. At least in Madrid, the city government was recast as a manager to the terrains dedicated to the urbanites' leisure. The area of Madrid, now known as the Paseo del Prado, the Prado Promenade, was key to establishing this reputation.
Let's get into Madrid's reputation and the role of the Prado Promenade in the cultivation of that reputation.
Okay.
Now, Madrid was not always the capital of Spain, and that role dates back only to the 16th century, but particularly in the 18th century, in the 1700s, you begin to see some major renovations to the city. And of course, the Paseo del Prado and the areas nearby to it were, well, they were at the heart of these changes. What did urban renovation mean for that street, for the city? How did the city change physically and symbolically?
Good question. Well, what's a capital? Usually capitals are not like Brasilia, built anew to house the government and the monuments. Most often, these are just small towns that suddenly have to accommodate a whole range of people and institutions. It's like an invasion. So imagine the 16th century and Philip II decides to move the court to the town of Madrid.
In fact, historically, the word court, la corte, was synonymous with the capital.
Exactly. So the city is forced to expand in order to fit the royal palaces and still have enough place for courtier and visitors. And who owns the land of this expansion? The crown does. Historically in Madrid, the addition concentrated around the area that I'm talking about in the article, which is the Prado. Now, the word itself means simply the meadow, and that's what it was. But when the royal palace was built there, and now there is just one wing remaining of that palace, it became the city's first thoroughfare leading to the royal residence.
And how did things evolve from there?
Well, the Prado then became the place where royal processions or courtly festivals were held. So it was a place in the city where the crown or the monarchy was manifesting itself, making itself visible to people, so to speak. But still, it was a meadow, something of a countryside for a very long time.
So historically speaking, first Philip II moves the capital, La Corte, the court, to Madrid, in the 16th century. And then in the 18th century, Madrid takes on a new importance for Carlos III.
Yes, the civilizing king whom I mentioned earlier, the one who decided to donate the land to the city of Madrid.
Why would he do that?
He was really keen on implementing a renovation typical for his age. Build a place where men and women of different classes could socialize in a transparent, linear, or public space. This is why the political history of modern Madrid, I believe, begins on the promenades, the areas that were specially designed for the purposes of giving a new shape to the free time of the Madrilenians. Carlos III, by the way, even though he was a king, is still considered Madrid's best mayor ever.
And the Prado is, of course, still there. It's, in fact, one of the areas that many visitors to the city today remember best.
Oh, yes. Anyone who has been to Madrid knows its alleys and fountains. Of course, in the past, you can walk for ages because there were no streets with lots of traffic crossing by. But that's not all. In the 1770, Carlos III, the same king I was talking about, decreed that the botanical garden be transferred. Next to that garden, the Museum of Natural Sciences was planned. The construction began in 1785, but it went so slowly that 5 years later, in order to generate more interest, the architect Juan Villanueva suggested expanding the project in order to incorporate a royal library, to make it a grand thing. So had he succeeded, the whole area would have become an Academy of Sciences with the botanical gardens and chemical labs, and it would be a kind of a city of knowledge in the city of Madrid. The building was eventually completed on a much smaller scale, and since 1819, the Royal Museum, which we now know as the Prado Museum, moved in. But here's an important issue. The places to spend free time in reality came as a transfer of land ownership from the court to the city. So in other words, the crown, which at the time was the state, was giving to the city the land, but it was a land already culturally transformed. So the land had been beautified from the crown's treasury, but it came with a price tag. The city's rights over urban space were now a moral obligation, a responsibility to create a community by offering new options to the inhabitants' pastimes.
This focus on the city's built environment during the 18th century, one could say, accelerated during the 19th century. What I mean is this was a time in which many European cities underwent extensive planning and renovation in the name of modernization, perhaps most famously in Paris with Haussmann, who, as urban geographer David Harvey puts it, bludgeoned the city into modernity with his characteristically broad avenues.
Exactly.
Things in Barcelona were similar with the plan of Ildefons-Cerdà, but you're not just interested in Madrid's planning or its built environment alone, but rather in how citizens used its central areas as a leisure zone.
Yes.
There's a sentence in your article that I want to read. You write that, this is the quote, "In 1868, when the revolution dethroned Isabel II, and until the dynasty was restored in 1874, a public debate about the forms and spaces of urban leisure definitely emerged." Tell us about that public debate and what consequences it had or it didn't have.
Well, thinking back to how the kings were giving the land to Madrid, and especially looking at the resulting Prado area, I think that the possibility of leisure was simply a main part of what public space meant. So the city considered it its obligation to keep public grounds open for all types of leisure because, in a nutshell, they were created for this purpose.
Yet apparently not all pastimes looked equally civilized from an Enlightenment perspective.
Sure, but still under the old regime, the regulation of public celebrations, even one involving considerable drunkenness and obscenity, sort of grotesque carnival behavior that Mikhail Bakhtin described, right? The carnivalesque behavior.
Yeah.
So that was minimal, and it usually came from the king, not the mayor. And when the old regime began to unravel after 1834, whenever the city and the crown clashed politically, the state and not the city would strike. The most famous example from the mid-19th century is the 1854 revolution. Then Queen Isabel II simply banned the festival of San Pedro on the Prado.
Really?
This became more interesting after the 1868 revolution. When the concept of the state was separated from the crown, I think we can witness a status quo. The city liberalized patron saint festivals and expanded their commercial component and did not regulate, and the state did not interfere.
Okay.
At the same time, the gated areas were emerging on and around the promenade. Some of them charged admission fees and enforced norms of behavior. But we cannot say that Madrid followed the tendency that the experts of British leisure discover, shift the masses away from the street and build gated areas charging admission. In fact, even when the development of the leisure parks was entrusted to private investors in Madrid, the city council kept the right to regulate the admission fee, 1 peseta, and the hours of operation, and ban the usage of fireworks.
So by this point, there is an evolving but new relationship forged between private interests and municipal governing bodies directly.
Right.
I think that the reader of your article is left with a nuanced view of how leisure intersects with politics. That is, you have to take into account state interest, municipal interest, which may not be the same, of course. Part of this is a matter of scale, and in the end, an increasing presence of the market or of commercial interests. Here's an anecdote from a colleague, Susan Larson of the University of Kentucky. In Madrid, the metro stop at the area of the Puerta del Sol, where the 15M protests were clustered, was recently renamed Sol Vodafone. And I'm reading online that Metro Line 2 there in Madrid is now Vodafone Line 2, named after the large cellular company. How can we better articulate this need to, as you put towards the end of your article, quote, harmonize the public and the private?
Well, let's just rename all the landmarks. Microsoft Gardens or...
Yeah, Microsoft Gardens.
Apple Garden, right? Sounds good. Just kidding. I still think that putting current conflicts into a historical perspective makes us savvy and maybe better prepared to see through different interests here. The 2011 events seem to suggest that the cities still have some interest in looking good and caring. Maybe we can use it to our advantage. There should be, of course, some discussion of what public good means.
Definitely.
And a good start would be, let's check the definitions of safety and public health that the authorities assume as obvious.
As your article suggests, letting people go wild was considered a common good even in the 1930s.
Exactly. It may be that the city authorities need to be reminded that their rights over urban land are grounded in an obligation to let citizens use them for leisure. Of course, such a hypothetical attitude would take a lot of steam out of the protests themselves. This is maybe why the indignados of Madrid resisted the term fiesta, festival. But political benefit may still be obtained from the mere defending the right to lounge or camp in the street.
Yeah.
And in addition, finding a harmony between the private and the public would entail insisting that the city does have interest in small business because this is what people support. This, of course, sounds pretty utopian to anyone who regularly rides Line 2 of the Madrid Metro.
Thanks for being here, Eugenia.
It was fun. Thanks for inviting me, Ben.
Eugenia Afinoguénova's article, Liberty at the Merry-Go-Round, Leisure, Politics, and Municipal Authority on the Paseo del Prado in Madrid, 1760 to 1939, is published in the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies 1.1, 2013. Also be sure to check out Afinoguénova's article on quality of life in Spain, forthcoming in Hispanic Issues Online. And, of course, look out for her book on the Prado when it comes out. Remember that you can access the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies in both print and online formats through Intellect Publishers. And make sure to follow our multi-authored blog for more urban discussions at urbanculturalstudies.wordpress.com.